Hello and welcome. I'm Eloise Carr. I'm the Director of the Tasmanian branch of the Australia Institute, and I'll be your MC for tonight. Thank you everyone for coming to our forum on power and partnership. What could Tasmania's next power-sharing government look like? Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the original owners of Lutruwita, Tasmania, and Nipaluna, Hobart, the country of the Muwinina people. As we meet here, we honour those people who are no longer here as a result of brutal colonisation, and the Tasmanian Aboriginal community of today who have never ceded sovereignty of these lands. It's always important to take a moment to acknowledge whose country we're meeting on, but especially during NAIDOC week this week. The Australia Institute adds our voice to calls for whomever forms Tasmania's next government to commit to real action on treaty, land return and heritage protection. Tonight we'll hear from each of our panel members first, and I'll start with my colleague Bill Brown, Director of the Australia Institute's Democracy and Accountability Program, who'll set the scene. I'll ask a few questions and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. There's a microphone in the middle, so start thinking about what questions you'd like to ask. We also have a very short, brand new video that I'd like to show you. If that's ready to roll, please.
I think it's really important to have a think tank, a group, looking at the overarching principles. One of the things that makes it special is that it encompasses all the issues confronting Australia.
The Australia Institute, it's revealed that 2/3 of people in this country believe corruption is common.
The Australia Institute shows 90% support for rules around truth in political advertising.
Well, more than half of the gas exported from Australia is royalty-free, according to research from think tank the Australia Institute.
The Australia Institute.
The Australia Institute.
The Australia Institute.
If we collect more tax and lower the price of energy, lower the price of medicine, lower the price of childcare, lower the price of going to the doctor, you know what we'll do? We'll lower inflation.
The question isn't whether Australia has the capacity to lead with integrity. The question is whether the people in this building have the courage to do it.
Poverty is a policy choice. These are things that can be addressed. We know how to do them.
I and others would argue that actually more often than not Australia's relationship with the United States makes us less safe.
This great submarine deal is almost certainly going to result in us having no submarines. It's a terrible, terrible mistake.
Government has to change its view.
Destruction of native forests.
Australia is one of the biggest consumers of fashion per capita in the world.
Climate integrity.
The Whistleblower Protection Authority.
Record profits and price gouging.
90% of Australians are saying, we think this is a good idea. Our parliament could do its job.
To have institutions like the Australia Institute doing original research that underpins the arguments of those who want to reconstitute the dream of democracy, that is the greatest gift to anyone who wants to keep the idea of democracy alive.
Thank you. So here we are in another election campaign, and the polls have been flip-flopping about which major party will win the most seats. But one thing that has been consistent across all predictions is that Tasmanians look set to return to vote for another power-sharing parliament, with crossbench members in the hot seat and they could determine Tasmania's next government. The Institute released polling yesterday that shows most Tasmanians support the major parties forming government with the Greens and independent crossbenchers if they can't form government in their own right. This means the Liberal and Labor voters are open to power-sharing governments, despite the narrative that these two parties are sometimes pushing. If Tasmanians return a power-sharing parliament, that should be respected. Indeed, more than twice as many Labor voters supported this than opposed it, which begs the question, will Dean Winter pass up the third opportunity to form government should he be given that chance again? I'd like to invite our panel members to come up. We're incredibly fortunate to have the former Premier, the Honourable David Bartlett, joining us tonight. He was the 43rd Premier of Tasmania between 2008 and 2011. Some of his government's key achievements included establishing Tasmania's Integrity Commission, right to information laws, and successfully lobbying for Tasmania to be the first to receive the national broadband rollout. Since leaving Parliament, David has co-founded a number of technology-based companies and holds multiple positions as chair and directors of several other companies. He also works with the not-for-profit sector on public policy development. We also have Christine Milne AO with us tonight, the former leader of the Australian Greens from 2012 to 2015. In 1993, Christine became the first woman to lead a political party in Tasmania and led the Tasmanian Greens for 5 years through a period of significant government reform, including to gun control, same-sex relationships and economics, as well as through a time of considerable turmoil in Tasmania's forests. Christine was one of Australia's Bicentennial Women Award winners, was appointed to the UN Global 500 Honour Roll and was elected to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Global Council. She continues to be an ambassador for the Global Greens. We've also got the Honourable Beck Thomas MLC, independent member for Elwick. Before Beck's election to the Legislative Council in 2024, Beck was an alderman to the Glenorchy City Council, serving as deputy mayor and then mayor. She also worked as a political advisor and had 10 years in the public service in the areas of sports and recreation and mental health. And last but not least, and I'll invite Bill to come up because he's going to speak first, Director of the Democracy and Accountability Program for the Australia Institute. Bill has a diverse responsibility for research at the Institute, including public opinion polling, forecasting to predict policy outcomes, truth in political advertising laws, digital technology, and the role of states and the Senate in Australian democracy. Prior to working at the Institute, he worked as an analyst across environmental, social, and governance responsibilities. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Eloise. Thank you, everyone. So I'll try to keep my remarks fairly brief, but I just want to provide a bit of an introduction to the kinds of topics we'll be talking about today. And I always try to start by emphasising that parliaments are designed to share power. They take their origin in the United Kingdom from the disagreements between the Crown and the rest of society about how decision-making takes place. In Australia, they're mostly divided into two bodies, an upper house and a lower house, to again divide the power and the responsibility for lawmaking. Even within political parties, factions negotiate power and positions between themselves and between other factions. The election of a representative is a kind of allocation of power from the people to their local member. I think it's important to have this reminder because when we have something like a hung parliament or a coalition government, we might see the sharing of power more openly, more publicly debated. But that power sharing was always happening. It happens in majority governments. It happens every day in politics. But we're here holding this event in Tasmania because of a very particular type of power sharing, which is, for the last year and a bit, Tasmania's had a minority government. And so I want to be clear about some of the terms that will come up tonight: hung parliament, minority government, coalition government. In short, a hung parliament is when you have an election and the result of that election is uncertain as to who will form government, because no one party holds a majority of the seats in the lower house, the House of Assembly in the case of Tasmania. That can resolve itself in a few ways. A minority government, where it's still one party that forms government, that provides the Premier and the ministers, that's responsible for administering the state day to day. But it depends on the support of crossbenchers. They might be Greens, Independents, Nationals, or so on, to remain in power. It has to keep their confidence. The alternative is a coalition government, where members of other parties or independents are actually brought into the government. They might take ministries in their own right. You might see Labor and Greens ministers, or Liberal and Greens, or Liberal and Nationals ministers, and so on. The most famous example, of course, of coalition government is the coalition, the Liberal National Coalition, which in various forms has survived for 102 years at this point. It's so successful at sharing power that we often think of those 2 or 3 or 4 parties as a single entity. But in fact, it's a very successful and ongoing negotiation of power, albeit with some hiccups, and indeed the coalition briefly fell apart at the federal level. It doesn't exist as a coalition in Tasmania. It doesn't exist as a coalition in Western Australia. But what we find, the Australia Institute looked at a whole variety of these power-sharing parliaments. So the people had elected a hung parliament, and then the parliament had to figure out for itself how it was going to resolve that situation, how it was going to share power between a major party and the people on the crossbench. Since 1989, Australia has had 25 power-sharing parliaments. So we think of majority government as the natural state of Australian government, but time and time again at the state level, in the territories, and at the federal level, that's not been the case. Parliaments have had to figure these things out for themselves. And what we learn from looking at those 25 case studies is that there's no rule book about how these negotiations have to go. Sometimes they're resolved quickly, sometimes they take 17 days, over a month in some cases. They can be little more than a handshake agreement, all the way to a 100-point policy document that the parties will be assessed on time and time again during the 4 years in power. They can involve all kinds of different elements, whether it's improvements to parliamentary processes, like a parliamentary budget office that provides economic and financial advice to the opposition and the crossbench. They can challenge the government with real hard figures. It can include more staff and resources for crossbenchers so they can scrutinise every piece of legislation. It can include positions, whether that's a ministry for an independent or minor party MP, or the speakership, so that they have control over the operation of the day-to-day business of Parliament. And it can be about policy. In the ACT, we have truth in political advertising laws thanks to a Greens crossbencher, thanks to the position they were in due to a power-sharing parliament. Earlier, the partial decriminalisation of sex work and drug use in the ACT, also negotiated by crossbenchers, as was the 100% renewable energy target, which the ACT hit in 2020, well before almost everywhere else in the world. In New South Wales, independents negotiated fixed 4-year terms, so you can't go back to the polls after just over a year. They negotiated the independence of the Ombudsman and the Auditor General from the government. In Tasmania, the first right to information laws come out of a power-sharing parliament. In Western Australia, the Nationals negotiate $8 billion worth of royalties reinvestment into the regions because they weren't in a coalition, and when the Liberals needed them, they were in a position of power to negotiate. The first debate on the war in Afghanistan happens thanks to the minority government that the Gillard government faced. All this is to say that the overall picture is one of flexibility, that people can be confident electing a parliament that shares power, because it can be resolved in so many ways that suit the people of Tasmania. They don't always work out, these power-sharing governments, but we find that most governments that share power are re-elected after their term. It's not a death sentence. Most of them see out their full term. Tasmania is actually unusual in going to the polls early after a minority government. And they can be very productive. Famously, the Gillard government passing more legislation than any other government on a day-to-day basis, including the NDIS, the Clean Energy Package, the Minerals Resource Rent Tax, and so on. So I'm really excited to hear from the other panellists, but I'm excited too for Tasmania and the opportunities that await. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. And if I could invite our other panel members to come up and join us on stage. And while you're coming up, I've just realised there's a couple of elected representatives in the audience. Thank you very much to Meg Webb, member for Nelson, and Helen Burnett, thank you, member for Clark. Thank you for coming tonight. David, would you like to come up? Thanks.
Well, thank you. I too would like to acknowledge the Aboriginal people, the Palawa people of Tasmania, and the lands on which I walk and the waters in which I swim. And I can see a couple of Tassie Cold Water Swimmer Groups members out there. So it is indeed a pleasure to be here. It's also a pleasure particularly to be on stage with Beck and Christine, two formidable women who are extraordinarily effective in their roles. Christine, her policy achievements and ongoing contribution I am in awe of. And Beck, a newer member of Parliament who just is an incredible advocate for her community, as she was as Mayor and now as member for Elwick, and particularly for the basketball community, of which I have some affection. So I thank you for your work, Beck. I also acknowledge other dignitaries in the room, my two local members. So I'll be pulling you up later on, Helen and Meg, but welcome both to you as well. It's a funny thing when you're an ex-politician, you regularly, from day one right until now, 12, 13 years later, get pulled up in the street or at a dinner party or wherever you happen to be. And the first question you're always asked is, do you miss it? And I always say, no. The only thing I miss about politics is a really good argument, but I've just had two teenage kids for the last 12 years, so I've get plenty of that as well. The second question people tend to ask you is, what do you regret the most? And I always say I've got a list a mile long of those things and all the things I could have done better and should have done better. If they're really, really interested, and it's pretty rare, maybe 1 in 10 people that stop you in the supermarket, they ask, what are you most proud of? And that question is easy for me. I'm most proud of the child and family centres that we built in the most disadvantaged communities in Tasmania that continue to change lives and make intergenerational differences within those communities. And I see the Libs have doubled down on them, and that's a great thing because this is long-term good policy. I'm most proud of my 10-point plan for restoring trust in democracy, RTI reform, Integrity Commission, whistleblower reform, all of which are due for more reform right now, and I see people like Meg Webb leading that charge. And the third thing I always say is the creation of the mechanism for a full-term minority government in Tasmania between 2010 and 2014. I'm most proud of having 2 Green members in my cabinet, an Australian first, and I'm most proud of a protocol that enabled us to disagree politely without exploding the government over every policy disagreement. Great credit, of course, has to go to Nick McKim, Cassie O'Connor and Lara Giddings, of course, who made it work after I stood down. The government did last for a full 4 years, and the power-sharing government that I led, never ever lost a vote on the floor of the House, which stands in stark contrast to what we've all just lived through for the last 14 months. So the question we have to ask ourselves, and I hope we can extract some wisdom for tonight for our current political leaders, is... there's not a glass of water around, is there? No. The question we have to ask ourselves is, of course, what were the ingredients, or what are the ingredients, thank you so much, such that a minority government, a power-sharing arrangement in the Tasmanian Parliament can last for 4 years, deliver good policy, deliver good outcomes for Tasmanian people, and deliver this thing we're most after, which is stability. I think there are two ingredients that are really important that we need to focus on. The first one is personal trusting relationships, and they take a lot of work and they are really hard in the bear pit of Parliament. Nick McKim had, and I'm going to do a bit of a chronology in a moment, and I had been opponents for the 4, 6, 7 years we'd been in Parliament together. And suddenly we realised, no, we need to work together now. And I see a fabulous operator up the back there too, Kath. Welcome to you, because you're a big part of this also. Nick and I had a personal relationship and some mutual respect in the Parliament. We also had our arguments. But we were able to build a trusting personal relationships on which there were never any surprises, at which our one-on-one with no advisors in the room meetings, always we were able to speak the truth to each other face to face with no surprises and no hurt intended. Real trust. And as we all know, as our parents taught us, trust takes a long time to build and a very, very short time to tear down. The second ingredient I think that made it a success in terms of, and there are many people who think it wasn't a success, of course, but I think it was, a protocol that can resolve policy conflicts without exploding the government every time there's a policy conflict, which inevitably there will be amongst 35 people in a lower house and another, how many upstairs? 15? I should know that, Meg. I was going to quote Paul Keating for a second there, but I won't. So a few historical facts in chronological order, and I'll go quickly. The election was held 4 years, full 4-year term we went, despite it being far more advantageous to me to have gone 6 months after I became Premier, when I was still riding high in the polls. The wheels were falling off this government, there's no doubt about it. It was a long-term Labor government where ministers had been arrested, police commissioners had been arrested, ministers were being sued by their drivers, ministers were employing family members under false names. I mean, wow, it was quite a clown car, but relative to this government we just lived through, I'm not so sure now. McKim ran one of the best election campaigns I've ever seen in my life in Tasmania in 2010. You should go back to the collateral for it. It was outstanding. The election was held, the polls were declared, we returned at 10, 10 and 5. I had partly foolishly said during the election campaign that I would, if in the event the Libs won more seats than us, I would give Hodgman the first chance to form a government. And I said also that I would not do a deal with anyone to stay in government. I advised the governor accordingly. Hodgman failed to convince the governor, despite multiple erroneous assertions he made to the governor at the time, that he could form a government. The governor withdrew and considered his position for a few days, just as Governor Baker has done recently. Nick, of course, cleverly, I think, came out the day before that Underwood did and announced that he was going to give Labor and me as Premier supply and confidence on the floor of the House. Then the governor came out and said, it's your incumbent duty, David, to go back into the Parliament and try and form a government. Well, we already knew we were in government because Nick had made that statement. So, we were back in government. The key question for me was then, how can we make this work and deliver a stable government for the next 4 years? Unfortunately, it was the day before Good Friday. I got in the car and I rang Nick for the first time since the election. Had not spoken to him since and said, why don't we go for a bike ride? Which some of you may recall. Foolishly, I then also accepted an invitation by my friend Tim Duckett and Bill Lark to go on a whiskey tasting evening that Thursday night. Brian Ritchie showed up, much whiskey was drunk, and I showed up to this bike ride at 11 a.m. the next morning with Nick McKim, exceedingly hungover, let the history books write. We went on that ride though, and the first thing we agreed on is that we would not discuss policy. We would not try to negotiate policy before we came to an arrangement to make the Parliament work. I would say, and I don't want to put words in Nick's mouth because he might not say this, that we said we won't make the mistakes of the Labor-Green Accord of 89 to 92, when Michael Field and Bob Brown tried to negotiate policy, did the accord, and then as soon as the policy split opened up, the accord also fell apart. That we would learn from that experience, and we would create a protocol on which we could disagree politely and then still get on with the business of government and solve any disagreement on the floor of the Parliament. So, I had, for a little bit of historical purposes as well, Mike Rann, the then South Australian Premier, rang me and said, I've got these letters that I wrote to, because he was in a minority government at the time too, and I wrote to the two independents that he formed a minority with. Would you like a copy of them? Yes, send them over. I think they came by fax. We read these letters, Nick and I, and we said, I think we can do that. So we constructed open letters. They're publicly available still. They should be published widely before Saturday week. And they're a protocol in which we explain and agree to how the two Greens would be in the cabinet, but when there was a contentious issue where the two-party platforms were so irreconcilable differences, the Greens could absent themselves from the cabinet and vote with their own party on the floor of the Parliament. Now, if I took a cynical view, you could say, chances are if the Greens weren't voting for something, the Libs would vote for it, so I was usually going to get my way on the floor of the Parliament. But it wasn't always the case. We had to work at solving problems, and our number one job was to try to keep the two Greens in the cabinet for all decisions. There were very few they ended up absenting themselves for. But essentially what we did was we built trusting relationships, and we built a protocol on which we could disagree without exploding the government over minor disagreements. As we got to the end of the pipeline track that we were riding on and repaired to the Ferntree Tav for a beer afterwards, Nick cleverly, I think, quoted Benjamin Franklin to me, and he said, "We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." And I guess that's where I want to leave you, because in lots of ways we did hang separately, and we were punished, I believe, both the Greens and the Labor Party in the electorate. No doubt there were many other sins we were being punished for, but we were certainly being punished for doing a deal with the Greens, which is the usual statement that we see rolled out in multiple advertising campaigns. Why is this electoral poison when I read the Australia Institute telling me that 61% of Tasmania, 61% of Labor voters want us to work with the Greens? That is not my personal experience, I'm sorry to say. I'm seen as a Greenturian candidate in the Labor Party, and the most abuse and hate I get from people these days is from Labor Party members for doing that deal. So, what are we to do? I don't believe we will ever see in my lifetime, I'm 57, I'm hoping to live another 30 years, but if I keep hanging out with Bill Lark and people like that, probably not. I don't believe we'll ever see another majority government in Tasmania in my lifetime. So we bloody well better grow up and work out how to make it work for the benefit of Tasmanians.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating, insightful, and very informative. Thank you. Christine, would you like to come up?
Well, thanks, Eloise, and thanks to the Australia Institute for actually hosting this forum tonight, because it is fundamental to a democracy that there's informed debate. It's not just about voting on the day, it's what happens in the public discourse in between times that's so important. So thank you for actually putting on this event. I too want to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on Aboriginal land, and given the topic here tonight, I want to say that one of the proudest moments I had in the Tasmanian Parliament was in balance of power with a minority Liberal government in 1996 to 98, when we persuaded the then Liberal Premier Tony Rundle to apologise to the Tasmanian Aboriginal people for the stolen generation. And there was a lot of talk about, well, we'll do it in the meeting room. And I said, no, we won't. We will do it on the floor of the House. That is the ultimate respect we can have. And so Annette Pearden came to the bar of the House and listened to the apology and then responded. And I can tell you that people were just so moved by it. And that was when the Aboriginal flag also flew over the Tasmanian Parliament and has pretty consistently flown over the Tasmanian Parliament in the years since. So that is one of the achievements of a minority government. And I just want to follow on with what David was saying, that in my view, the biggest steps forward in public policy in Tasmania over the last 35 years have been in periods of minority government. That is the fact. So let me just go through some of them. So in 1989 was the Labor-Green Accord, where we had 5 members, 5 independents, independent Greens if you like, and 13 people from the Labor Party. We did make a huge list, and in hindsight, that's a lesson that we learned. Not such a long list is a desirable thing, but we made a long list of policy requirements, but we didn't focus on how we would build the relationship. And as David said, that's something he learnt, that's something I certainly learnt from the period of 1989 to 92. But having said that, we doubled the size of the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area. We achieved the Douglas Apsley National Park and the Friendly Beaches National Park. We instituted a parliamentary research service. This was a big new idea because people in the Tasmanian Parliament couldn't see why you'd need a research service. Why would you need information to actually inform the prejudice that you might hold? So, but anyway, we got a Tasmanian parliamentary research service, which of course has been a fundamental part of the Parliament, and now people don't even realise that there was a time when that didn't exist. We also addressed the economic mess that Tasmania was in, and that is another thing that minority parliaments do. In 1989, we all thought Tasmania was in a really good financial position because Robin Gray told us it was. It was a majority government, and we had no reason to believe otherwise. And it wasn't until it was a minority government, and so the power comes back to the floor of the House to actually explore the books, that we discovered that Tasmania was in a terrible debt crisis. And instead of walking away from that, it was basically the job of Michael Field and his Labor Party people and the Greens to work together. And it was I can tell you, I have nightmares about it still, about the rallies outside, because we had to cut the very services that we promised to fund. And there is nothing worse as a person elected to Parliament than having gone through an election campaign promising teachers that you'll give them more special services, hospitals, more things and so on, and then afterwards actually going into austerity. It was beyond cuts, it was austerity measures. And we did that and got Tasmania back on its feet. And again, we had to do it in 96, and again, David Bartlett had to do it in his period of government as well. So for those people who argue, oh, you have to have stable majority government for the finances of the state, in fact, the most responsible governments in terms of finance have been and continue to be minority governments. In the 1996 to 98 period, we not only had the apology that I mentioned, but the Port Arthur massacre occurred, and we had gun law reform. And we would not have had the gun law reform, the significant gun law reform that underpinned then Howard's national gun law reform if the Greens hadn't been in balance of power and we hadn't had Roland Brown and the Gun Control Coalition having done so much work in the community for years on what was necessary. And so the lesson from that was when you're in opposition and you've got no power, you do the work on the legislation and the regulation and so on that you would actually like to happen, so that when you do get in a position to deliver, you actually have what you want and can work on it and get it delivered straight away. Gay law reform, balance of power. It was interesting, the Labor Party actually liked the idea of gay law reform, but they didn't have the courage to move on it because they thought it would be rejected in the northern half of the state, which is very conservative. And so Tony Rundle, who was the Liberal Premier, said to me, as a result of an arrangement we made, that if I could persuade the lower house if I could get it through the lower house, and he would give the Liberals a conscience vote, if I could get it through the lower house, he would instruct the Leader of Government Business for the Liberals in the upper house to force it through. And so that is the arrangement we made, and we achieved gay law reform, and both Liberal and Labor were very pleased that it was my private member's bill because the Greens got the blame for it. And I'm very happy to have the blame for it. But that's what I mean about the negotiation and people seeing how you can actually move policy forward in ways that you couldn't do if you were a majority, actually, in that sort of circumstance. Then, of course, in 2010 to 14, here in Tasmania, as David talked about, we had 2 Greens in Cabinet, and the biggest greenhouse gas reduction Tasmania has ever seen occurred during that period with the protection of the forests. And on the national accounts, you will see the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions during that period. And Cassie did a great job with public housing too, with energy efficiency and solar and other things. But federally, it was interesting because I was in balance of power with the Gillard government, and that was really where I was able to bring together the experience I had had through the various other periods of minority government to really get the outcome we wanted. I wanted a carbon price. I knew it had to be legislated by a certain date, and I knew we had to have a mechanism to deliver it, and so we delivered the Multi-Party Climate Committee with independent experts, because the lesson I'd learned at that point was you have to create the space for people to change their mind. That is the key to collaboration in a minority government, because pride comes into it. People have been out there standing on a certain policy position. You have to create the space for them to reasonably be seen to change. Otherwise, people get locked in because they just can't be seen to change. But all these possibilities are there if there is a willingness from people elected to put their shoulder to the wheel in the public interest. That is the difference between minority and majority government, because majority government in Tasmania and nationally has actually meant state capture. The political parties have been captured by big corporate interests, and they deliver for those corporate interests, not necessarily and mostly not in the interests of the Tasmanian community. And we've seen that in Tasmania with North Broken Hill, with guns, with federal hotels, with Tar Ann, with the fish farms, and so on and so forth. They're usually multinational companies coming in here, and the political parties will do deals in the back room, and there's no transparency. And if I had one thing I would do at this election to save the Tasmania $1 million, it's get rid of the Controller General and his secrecy, because he is exempt from freedom of information laws, and that is just ridiculous that he can stitch up all those deals and nobody knows anything about it. So we could actually do some good things there. So finally, I just want to say that this election, it's more important than ever, in my view, to have a power-sharing parliament, because we are in an ecological collapse. People perhaps are not thinking about that so much, but the reality is we are beyond seven tipping points, 7 of the 9 tipping points. We're already beyond those tipping points. We are in an extinction and a climate collapse. That is a fact. Secondly, we are in geopolitical chaos, with Trump having blown up the World Trade Organization, blown up just the geopolitics everywhere. You cannot rely on a supply chain anymore. You simply can't. And so Tasmania we've got to deal with ecological collapse, we've got to deal with trade, uncertainty and insecurity, and we've got to deal with the fact that the Liberal government of the last X number of years has accumulated a debt such that we're going to have to work out how we're going to get out of it. How are we going to raise money? Because obviously you have to raise revenue and cut expenditure. It's as simple as that. And how are we going to do it? And the only way we're going to have people come together and talk about a realistic plan for Tasmania that is integrated, that looks at well-being for Tasmanians and resilience in the face of these crises, is to have every single person who's elected put their shoulder to the wheel and recognise that the people put them there and the people expect them to work together once they are elected. They have no right to say they will not talk to other people, they will not negotiate with people. That is not democratic. And I am just so thrilled after 35 years, really, to have a public meeting such as this, supportive of the idea of power sharing and collaboration and negotiation, instead of always having to defend it in the face of stable majority government from the corporate interests of Tasmania. So thank you for coming out, thank you for thinking about it, and I'm keen to continue the discussion.
Thanks so much, Christine. Beck, you're up next, and then we're going to get into questions and discussion.
Thank you, Eloise. Good evening, everybody. I thank the Australia Institute for the invitation tonight to be on what is a very esteemed panel. I find myself up here with a former Premier and a party leader, and I really acknowledge and appreciate the contributions that they have made to our great state of Tasmania and continue to make, and to be engaged here tonight is just fantastic to hear your thoughts. And certainly I've got some common themes that I'll share from what you have both contributed, and thank you also to Bill for being on the panel and for setting the scene for us and for the research that the Australia Institute does to help inform us all. So in my opening contribution this evening, I'll cover 4 key things. 1, I'll acknowledge that a power-sharing parliament requires effectively managing relationships across both houses of parliament. 2, I'll talk about the importance and characteristics of effective relationships. 3, ponder a thought-provoking comparison to local government. And 4, share my hopes for the 52nd Parliament of Tasmania. Firstly, I think it's important to acknowledge that our bicameral parliament requires power sharing across both houses of parliament to govern. The government needs the confidence and supply across all 50 members of parliament to function, not just the 35 members of the House of Assembly, but also the 15 members, David, of our Legislative Council. We hear a lot about confidence and supply deals, but only with reference to the House of Assembly, even though the government also needs supply from the Legislative Council to function. If a minority government doesn't need to do confidence and supply deals with upper house members to form government, why does it need them with lower house members? And are they even worth the paper they're written on, if they are even written down? During replies on the recent budget, which of course didn't complete the passage through the Parliament due to the early election, some Legislative Council members signalled they were actually not sure whether they could, in fact, support this budget. Confidence and supply of the Legislative Council is not guaranteed. There are now 8 independent members and 1 Green member in the upper house, making up 9 out of 14 votes on the floor, with just 3 Liberal and 2 Labor members, and of course the President. Therefore, regardless of the makeup of our next House of Assembly, the Legislative Council will continue to hold significant power, or perhaps better framed as responsibility, on behalf of Tasmanians in determining whether or not supply is granted and the government's legislative agenda is supported. Whoever is in government must be cognisant and respectful of this and must seek to engage and consult with all major party leaders and independent members of the Parliament across both houses. I acknowledge that it takes considerable will, time and effort to effectively manage relationships and to build trust, as David said, to achieve outcomes. But fundamentally, effective relationships are everything. You simply cannot achieve outcomes without them. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to personally like each other, doesn't mean you have to agree on everything, doesn't mean you have to hold the same values. In my view, an effective relationship in any setting requires 4 key traits. 1, being willing to engage on issues from a position of mutual respect and trust. 2, listening to hear and to understand rather than listening to respond. 3, being prepared to negotiate and compromise. And 4, doing what you say you'll do. When I was elected a mayor of a new council at Glenorchy in 2022, my number 1 priority was to build trust around that council table. My number 1 priority as mayor on day 1 of our induction was to get to know the other elected members, to set the tone and to develop an environment of mutual respect, an environment where we all felt like we were equals. I said just that we don't have to like each other, we don't have to agree with each other, but we must remember that the community has elected us to work together to serve their best interests, and we must commit to working together and demonstrating harmony around the table for the people we represent. And this was a council that had quite a diverse range of backgrounds and experience in the elected members. We had a former Lord Mayor of Hobart and Speaker of the House of Assembly. We had a former Mayor of Glenorchy, a former member of the Federal Parliament, me as a relatively new mayor, our first Greens councillor who was elected to the council running on a Greens platform. It was a very diverse table, and one of the key things that I emphasised during that very first induction was that regardless of the background or experience we have, we all just have just one vote. None of us are more important than the other. During that induction session, we had the opportunity to be clear about our needs and expectations of each other and to put up on the board what motivated us and what we hope to achieve during our term. This setting the scene was really important for how that council operated through the term, and I'm proud to say that it was a council that did demonstrate harmony around the table through that term. Let's imagine what that could look like for the Parliament. Could our next Premier call us all together at the start of the 52nd Parliament of Tasmania? Could we all come together, all 50 members, or at least party leaders and independents, come together and talk about our aspirations and what motivates us and make a pact to work together in the interests of the people who we represent, who we owe that to? Perhaps would this be a better use of time than the full pomp and ceremony of another traditional opening session of Parliament just over a year on? Let's also imagine what would happen if the same expectations of local government applied to state government when it comes to governance. If a council was managing its budget and major projects like the government has been, and if there was as much dysfunction around the table as there has been, it would most likely be put into administration pending a Board of Inquiry review. In fact, this is what happened at Glenorchy City Council back in 2016-17, and although it was costly, it was certainly necessary for a reset. As a result of the Board of Inquiry, there was not only an election to bring in a new council, but also a series of ministerial directions setting out over 50 actions the council was to undertake to restore good governance. Similar processes have occurred for a number of councils over recent years. Could members of the 52nd Parliament, with the help of experts, develop some directions for good governance Perhaps we can bring in David Bartlett to help us agree upon to ensure effective governance over a full term. Could committees play a greater role in the Parliament to ensure good governance and fairer distribution of power? Should we have a budget committee and a better budget process whereby members of Parliament are engaged early on? We have budget estimates before the budget's fully formed, rather than after the fact. So many options for doing things differently if only we have the will to consider this. Could committee recommendations be binding on government? So what will our next power sharing Parliament look like? I think it's very hard to predict exactly. As Eloise said earlier, the polls are flip-flopping. But what I do hope is that there is a greater focus on relationships within the Parliament and outside it. Two key things I hope for in our 52nd Parliament of Tasmania are, one, our next Premier chooses relationships as their only portfolio, so they can focus on genuine engagement with party leaders and independents at a personal level, rather than relying on advisors in the middle. They should not assume responsibility for any specific portfolios if they want to be able to do the job properly. And two, that all members of Parliament across both houses remember that above all, we are elected to work together to serve the best interests of the Tasmanians who elected us. In accordance with this, I hope all members can adopt an approach to engagement that is centred around those 4 key traits of effective relationships I mentioned to make this work across a full term. Relationships work both ways. Every one of the 50 members must be prepared to respectfully engage, listen to hear, negotiate and compromise, and do what they say they'll do for things to work in this 52nd Parliament of Tasmania. Because relationships are everything, you simply cannot achieve outcomes without them. Thank you.
Thank you, Beck. I'd like to start with some questions just to kick off discussion, and I'll put the first question to you, David, but I would encourage others to also join in. Sharing of power is always going to be challenged, both by those whose entrenched power is threatened by sharing it and by those who fear that strong policies may become too compromised. You've already touched on some really important points in terms of cultural and other changes in order to achieve a power-sharing government. But perhaps I could just invite you to tease out a little bit more of the cultural changes that you observed within the Labor Party, but also did you notice the Greens adjusting to the realities of power and government?
It's an excellent question, thank you. Probably the first time I was really struck after we're in a new world here was, we'd had the swearing in of the new ministry up at Government House with the wonderful Governor Underwood, formal ceremony, repair to the room for, a glass of wine or whatever, and I looked around the room and one of the first person that I caught the eye of was Christine Milne. I thought to myself, what are you doing at my swearing in? Oh, that's right, we're in government together now. Emblematic perhaps of the challenges of changing the culture of the Labor Party was I hadn't invited Christine, presumably she'd been invited by Nick and Cassie. I'd invited Michael Field, but he angrily refused to come. So that might be emblematic of the challenges of cultural change in the Labor Party when it comes to understanding where the future lies. We also found ourselves soon after that at a dinner at Government House with the new cabinet with, again, the wonderful Governor Underwood, and I'd been to a few of these things before. Very formal, very, polite conversation. Everyone picks up and leaves at 9:30 p.m. This went well into the night while Governor Underwood, as Professor Peter Boyce would say, part of the job of the Governor is to encourage his or her ministers and Premier. And Underwood spent a lot of time encouraging us to work together. It was one of the most fantastic dinners I've ever been, or certainly the best dinner I've ever been to at Government House, where real conversations happened and the Governor was really engaged with how to make this whole thing work. And it felt like we were on the precipice of something really exciting and really energetic and really terrific. Nick and Cassie proved to be, as I absolutely knew they would be, extremely capable, diligent and competent ministers who were deeply respected by the public sector who worked most closely with them. And on that note, I still bump into senior public servants from that day, from those times, a fair bit, and they often tell me that was one of the most exciting times in the public sector as well, because we were doing really interesting things and working in really complex environments, no doubt about it, but did a real focus on really good public policy as opposed to the politics of the day. So I guess I'm both a bit depressed about cultural change and the lack of my ability to affect it, or our ability as a Labor Party to affect change. But equally, I know, and I've said this many times in public before, we did much better public policy, or I led a government that did much better public policy in minority than we did when we were in majority.
I just wanted to follow up, Eloise, you said about, the challenge is from the people who have the entrenched power and don't want to share it. One of the biggest cultural challenges that has to shift in Tasmania is from the business community, because they are the ones who do not want to share it. They like the back rooms, they like the deals, they like the secrecy, lack of transparency, lack of accountability and so on, and that is why they prefer majority government, and that is why they run mega campaigns to try to achieve it. And I just want to go back to 1989 in that way, when Edmund Rouse was the chairman of Examiner Northern Television. He was also the chair of Guns, and he tried to bribe a newly elected Labor Member of Parliament to cross the floor to stop the Labor-Green Accord coming to power. And I think that pretty much sums up, that's the connection between the media, the particular political parties and the individuals, because in Tasmania we don't have degrees of separation. When it comes to some of those big business people, they just pick up the phone and they can get straight through to whoever they need to speak with. So the cultural challenge is not only in political parties, but it is desperately needed in the business community to give up on the idea that they can do deals in the back rooms and not have to have them made transparent, and to actually realise they're going to have to justify what they want to enough members of Parliament who think it's good enough to then support. So I think that's really a critical thing, and I just see it now with the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and you just go, here we go again and again and again. Things are not going to change until they change.
So Christine, you were able to achieve cultural change, and some of those changes have been lasting since the Gillard minority government. Could you give us some examples of ways that governments can build trust with crossbenchers?
Yes, it was interesting with Julia Gillard. To her great credit, she made an enormous effort to build a relationship with the Greens in balance of power, with Tony Windsor, with Rob Oakeshott, with right across the other independents. Every week she set aside half an hour to give to each one of those different groups, and she sat down and she listened, she understood what the concerns were, and she would then instruct her ministers to go and have follow-up meetings or to sort something out and so on. It's a bit like the protocol David was talking about, but it was a mechanism. And she committed to it, and that was really important. In others, in the Labor Green Accord, we had no real mechanism for sorting out disputes. When we got to the minority government in 1996, there was no arrangement with the Liberals, but they appointed a liaison officer whose job was purely just to keep the conversation going, to alert us to what the government would be wanting to bring on, if we had issues with that, to organise briefings for us and all that sort of thing. So there was that commitment from them, and as I said with Gillard, it was important. The thing is, it's about trust. It's not only the regular meetings and the liaison people, it's honouring whatever you say you will do, you will do. That is so important. So you don't have to agree, but if you agree to disagree, then that is the position. So everybody knows what to expect when a matter comes before the Parliament, or when an issue is being handled, and what people are going to say. And that is where, when Tony Abbott became Prime Minister and I was in balance of power, I couldn't trust him to actually deliver what he said. I went to see him in my first meeting with him in balance of power, and they had argued that they were going to excise 74,000 hectares of forest from the World Heritage Area, you might remember. They had a whole campaign on that. After the election, I went to see him and said that would be a major issue for us in balance of power. We would not support that happening. And he said, I never said that. I never said that. That's not my position. What's locked up is locked up. And I said, well, that isn't what you campaigned on. Can I have that in writing? Yeah, I'll give it to you in writing. Well, of course, I didn't get it in writing. And within a week, they'd notified the World Heritage Committee that they were moving to excise the 74,000 hectares. And so I said to him after that, I can't deal with you in balance of power, because the one thing we have to be able to do is walk out of this room and all know we're on the same page, and we're going to honour whatever it is that we have just agreed or not agreed. So that is really one of the fundamentals, is ongoing relationships and the mechanism to sort out problems. The Multi-Party Climate Committee was my idea, and it came from negotiating gay law reform in Tasmania. Was my experience with that. If you bring in independent experts, never been done before federally in Cabinet, to have a Cabinet committee that brought in 4 unelected people, but they were experts in their field. And why it was so good was it created the space, as I said before, for people to change their mind. So Ross Garnaut would be sitting there, climate scientist Will Steffen was sitting there. We had a woman from Victoria who was an expert in social justice, and we had Rod Sims, who was Conservative economist. And we would be talking about things we could put in the clean energy package, how we would create the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, the Renewable Energy Agency, and so on and so on. People would propose something, and Garnaut would then come in and say, well, you could do it like that, but have you thought this might be a better way of doing it? And so on. And so people didn't feel like their position was being negated. It was just a general discussion about how to try to make everything better. And so that's something I would really like to see in the Tasmanian Parliament, to make more use of the committees, but also to actually bring in experts to enable that depth of policy, but also to negotiate a better compromise than otherwise might have been had.
What a radical thought, valuing expertise. God, you're such a radical. Well, but I think I'll make a point here. You know, we've had I'm recently met with Rick Snell, who's doing a review at the moment for the government on new RTI, forced by the crossbenchers to do this. And I said to him, why are you doing this? The last 2 experts, Gruen and Saul, have just been completely publicly trashed for their expertise. And I said to Rick Snell, are you ready to be completely publicly trashed by this government when they don't like your recommendations? Oh, well, Rick's pretty relaxed about that.
The only thing I might add is that I think it can help build trust when reforms happen to parliamentary processes. Then you're less dependent on the goodwill of the government or being able to punish the government, because you can depend on, for example, dedicated time for crossbenchers to bring on their own private members' bills, to be debated, even to be voted on. I mentioned the Truth in Political Advertising bill that a Greens crossbencher put up. Well, she could depend on having a lot of time for that debate to take place. Once it was debated, the bill got unanimous support, but it was getting it to that point that, that allowed every member of Parliament to commit to getting it done. You see that at the federal level in Australia. A lot of the improvements that could happen to the House of Representatives and how it conducts its business have already happened in the Senate, because they have 70 years, well, not quite 70 years, but they have decades and decades of dealing with, what is effectively a minority government in that House. We don't call it that, but they've had to deal with a crossbench. And I think that can help, seeing those reforms happen can help give confidence to crossbenchers that the government's serious.
Next question's for you, Beck. Excuse me. The upper house in Tasmania is unique because it's majority independent. Everywhere else in the country, Labor and Liberal voting together have a majority. As the number of people voting independent has increased on the mainland, people have been saying that a parliament with more independence would lack discipline and focus. Can you talk to us about how the Legislative Council works with an independent majority, please?
Absolutely, and I would say it works very well with an independent majority, and I can't imagine it any other way. I feel very fortunate to be part of a Legislative Council family, I call it, where we have the environment that is conducive to respectful and robust debate. It serves as a really effective house of review because it has a majority of independents, whilst at the same time it provides the opportunity for debate on motions raised by non-government members, and we, challenge each other's thinking in a respectful way. Sometimes we even change our minds, and isn't that a wonderful thing? That is how debate should be. Something that blew my mind coming from local government, and I know I feel like I'm stuck in local government, I keep mentioning it, it's only been a bit over a year, but coming from local government where, under your code of conduct, you have to go into debate with an open mind. It's really frowned upon to be open about your position before the debate is had. So coming into, the Parliament where where people are sitting on something before the debate even starts, it's a really interesting difference that I think there's a lot to be gained from actually listening to debate and listening to different views and ideas before forming a position on things. And I think I feel like we have more capacity and more willingness to do that in the Legislative Council, which leads to better outcomes ultimately. If you're prepared to be flexible in your thinking and have your ideas challenged, you're going to get better outcomes. In terms of the passage of legislation, with just 3 government members in the House, the government relies heavily on the leader of government business. It's a really tough gig in the Legislative Council to be the leader of government business. There's a lot of pressure on that person. They rely on the leader to put their case forward and provide other members with the information that we need to make informed decisions. And, we all rely on being really well informed in the Legislative Council. We ask hard questions. We demand, for want of a better word, more evidence. We ask, what's the problem you're trying to solve with this piece of legislation, and where's the evidence that the solution you're proposing with this bill will actually solve the problem? We require that evidence is before us in order to be able to make a decision. We're not afraid to adjourn debates or send things back or, send things to committee or make amendments if we're not satisfied that we're going to get the best outcome for Tasmanians. So, that's absolutely a strength of the independence in the upper house, and something that is really important to continue long into the future, in my view. We have group briefings as as the Legislative Council. So again, you know, the Leader of Government Business knows that Legislative Councillors will only make decisions if they're feeling informed. They offer us briefings from departmental staff. We have community stakeholder groups come in to brief us on their views. It's a really important part of the process. One of the challenges is often we're having briefings on the day that we're debating bills. You know, it feels really rushed. So again, to that reform of process, that could be possible to make better informed decisions. Again, going back to council, we would have workshops at council weeks before a motion would come through to ask us to approve something at Glenorchy City Council. We would workshop ideas around the table. We would hear elected members' concerns and questions. We would, I guess, come to a position where people's ideas were input, so you weren't making amendments on the run so often. You know, other people's views were being considered well before you were actually deciding on something. And I think that's a really effective way to make sure people feel heard and make sure they have the opportunity to shape it. Bringing people on the journey is so important, and that's something that's not been done well. And that includes both members of Parliament and the community. Bringing people on the journey in legislative reform is critical, I think, to be an effective government. So ideally, I think there's opportunity to improve those processes by having those workshop sort of opportunities, and that will result in better legislative outcomes.
We're a little behind schedule, Bill, but just really quickly, there's more to integrity and accountability than elected representatives. You've already touched on truth in political advertising as one example. Do you just want to briefly run through a couple of ideas of what will help keep democracy healthy, and is Tasmania on the right track with any of those?
Yeah, so I think Parliament has these awesome powers. It can extract information from government departments that would otherwise never see the light of day. It can hold up the entire legislative agenda until the government does something, if it has the will to do so. It can bring down governments, as we've seen in Tasmania. But there's no guarantee that that power is used or that it's used well, which is why having an engaged population, one that can extract information for itself through right to information requests, one that knows who is putting pressure on governments and can use that to figure out why, by having public ministerial diaries where you can see the lobbyists meeting not only the ministers but also their staff, which can be just as valuable as meeting the minister themselves. Anti-corruption commissions that are well resourced and hold public hearings so that people can see justice being done and can see anti-corruption at work, are all examples. And unfortunately, in some of those ways, Tasmania is quite far behind. Ministerial diaries are disclosed, but not in as much detail as in other states. We have Queensland, for example, where shadow ministers also disclose their diaries. You've got the disclosures from staff and their meetings in other places. The Australian Institute had Robert Redlich, former Anti-Corruption Commissioner for Victoria, out in Tasmania last year, really troubled by the lack of resources that Tasmania's own Integrity Commission has. And despite in some ways having the powers it needs, not having exercised those, not holding public hearings when we'd like to see them take place, for example. So yeah, I think it's important that while we recognise the role that Parliament can play, there's no guarantee that it uses that power well if the people aren't able to access the information, if there aren't those integrity officers holding the government and Parliament to account.
Please.
Yes, if I can just add to that, the Tasmanian Integrity Commission, I think, either should be abolished or properly funded and given the powers it needs to do the job, because at the moment it's where scandals go to die. the parliamentarians love it because they just refer something to the Integrity Commission, and then the media asks them and they go, oh no, I couldn't possibly talk about that, that's been referred to the Integrity Commission, that's going to be investigated. And 2 years later you get a little 3 lines in the paper saying it was investigated and nothing was found to be anything. And so they got away with absolutely with murder, in my view. So that is one thing where Tasmania is a mile behind. It's great that it was set up in the first place, which was under the minority government that David led, but it needs to be properly funded and have the teeth and the willingness to actually act and do what's required to do. But it's the same with the Auditor General. You know, all of these accountancy people holding public office to account need to be funded. Otherwise, you can have as much as you like on the, you know, in theory, but if they don't have the people to actually do the work and actually make the reports and so on, you end up with nothing while appearing to have everything. The same with freedom of information or right to information. The government has become very good at just redacting everything, so they will release a document and it's just all black. So they say, yes, they released it under right to information, but it's just none of the information in it can be available to the public. So those sorts of things, if they change, that would help to build trust from the community into the Parliament and the public service, because people would see that people were being held to account and people could make complaints and have a reasonable expectation that they would be investigated appropriately. So we really need to make sure we up the ante and get serious investigative powers and funding for these, together with, as Bill has said, truth in advertising, anti-SLAPP legislation, overturn the protest laws. There's a whole range of things we need to do, but funding those integrity measures is critical.
Do we have any questions from you guys? Now's your opportunity. Do you want to hop up to the mic or...?
Yeah, Tom Johnson. I've got a question for David. So given the enemy within, i.e. Labor, that you've mentioned, you've referenced twice, does the leader of the Labor Party, given his statements to date and his multiple opportunities to date to do it, have the character to actually come back to the people? And so a second question, which is for Christine and Beck. Christine, you mentioned the gay law reform, fabulous. So Liberal and Labor stood back while the Greens do the dirty work. Or I shouldn't call it that, the hard work. Conversely, are Liberal and Labor likely to, with the stadium in mind, in a new parliament, just get together, and which we know they do, and push that through? And I guess that's where Beck comes in and how's the legislative do that?
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Well, look, just let the record show I didn't use the term the enemy within, but that's fine. Look, I'd say this. Dean Winter's a friend of mine, and I have supported him, mentored him for 10 years because I genuinely believe he will be a good Premier. Now, the reason why I believe that is because he's actually got a great policy brain, and I'm very focused on good public policy outcomes, and I believe he is too. Now, having said that, I believe we all get caricatured as politicians, and once you've got a caricature, it's very hard to lose it. Unfortunately, I think for Dean, this election's come way too early, and he's been caricatured in a particular way. But I still have want to put it on the record, I still have a great amount of faith that he will be an excellent Premier of Tasmania if he gets the opportunity to do so. Having said all that, and I accept the premise, go back to the premise of your question now, and I'll go back to the kind of final part of my talk. That is, it's considered in the Labor Party electoral poison to be in bed with the Greens, do a deal with the Greens, whatever lines they want to use, kind of said. It's probably electoral poison for me to just be sitting next to Christine. You know what I mean? I'll get the cooties or whatever. I don't know what it is. I kind of understand it, because the truth is at the polls, that's how Tasmanians treated us after the 89, after the 89-92, and after the 2010-2014 government. So the law, or the accepted wisdom in the Labor Party is, you do a deal with the Greens, you'll suffer for 10 years in the polls. And really, that has played out over the last 25 years. So as aspirational politicians, and I believe the Labor Party is simply a vehicle for progressive people to gain influence to affect progressive change. That's what I believe the Labor Party is and should be. So we want to gain influence, which means you have to be in government. If you want to be in government, you've got to win seats and win votes. And the accepted wisdom is you don't do that if you get in bed with the Greens. Now, I don't necessarily believe that, but disproving it is very hard. There's another really good example of this in Tasmanian politics, that because Tony Rundle went to the 1998 election with council amalgamations, he's now and lost. It is now accepted law in Tasmania that you cannot amalgamate councils because it's deeply unpopular, which I think is bullshit. I actually think we'd all like to see a bit of sensible council restructuring and so on, if it was done well and over a period of time and well planned and so on. That's my personal view, and I think it's the majority view of Tasmanians. I've got local government here, maybe not. But we kind of get these things written into liturgy almost, and they're very hard to break free from. So I understand why Dean's taken this position. I did say I had a self-imposed media blackout that I've broken twice now already, because I'm here and I did an interview on YouTube with some guy last night. And I said in that what Nick McKim did was pretty clever, I think. The day before the governor came out and said he's sending me back in, he took power by saying we're supporting Bartlett because we know he's going to be back in government and we want to wield influence with that, is really. Now, there's no reason why Rosalie Woodruff couldn't do that after the election. And what does Dean Winter say? We're not accepting confidence and supply from you? You could, but probably even I might resign from the Labor Party then.
But he did do that just before they moved the no confidence motion, so he's already done that.
I think that's not quite true, because my understanding of what happened with the governor was the governor did not ask Dean Winter to go back in to try to form a government on the floor of the House. Now, I don't know what the private conversation with the governor was, and no one does, except for Dean and the governor, and that's fair. But if he had have been asked by the governor, can you form a government on the floor of the House, my advice to him, and not that he necessarily takes my advice, would be go and give it your best shot. You should do that.
Well, Rose did come out prior to him going to the governor saying the Greens would consult with Labor about forming government, so it was the same as what Nick had done.
I'm going to have to...
Never mind. As you see, it's all...
I listened to Rosalie's words very carefully when she said that, and she was talking about a negotiation, whereas Nick did not say we're negotiating, he just said we're supporting Bartlett and the Labor government. There was a difference.
Okay. All right. Anyway,
we've been in furious agreement until now, though.
That's fine. But also in 1996, Ray Groom was the leader of the Liberal Party, majority Liberal Premier. He went into the election saying that he would not govern as minority. He would only govern as a majority. They didn't win the majority, and so they immediately removed him as the leader. Put Tony Rundle in because he said, well, he never said that, so he's now there. And so he became the Liberal Premier. So Labor has got that option should they choose to take it.
I can't be advocating a coup on the leader on stage here, this early in his career. Well, there's a whole range of things that can happen, but I go back to, and I think we are in furious agreement here, that it's about trust and personal trust. Don't have to like each other, but you've got to have personal trust. And a protocol, a mechanism, a facility with which you can resolve your differences before it explodes.
I just want to answer the second part of the question, which was what happens though if we end up with a minority and a number of independents elected and Greens and various, but Labor and Liberal vote together on the floor for the stadium and a range of other policies which the independents and the Greens don't support. And it's now reached the stage where on a lot of major policy issues there is no difference between the major parties in terms of those. And so at some point, instead of just thinking it's always going to be up to the independents and the Greens to select who's to be in government, there is no reason why Tasmania couldn't have a grand coalition and actually do what people see it as basically that's the old jobs and growth neoliberal old style, extractive industry style. And if you want that lot over there, it's a mixture of those. And then the others are the opposition, the progressive opposition. And I think that is a potential Tasmania could go down.
Well, if it's 10, 10, 5 and 10, 15, why not? Why don't, Beck, you might be a minister, we'd have Meg as a minister for sure, Ruth Forrest could be treasurer, I suspect, and, let's see it.
But on the issue of Liberal and Labor voting together on something like the stadium, when the Greens and the crossbench are opposed to the stadium, how are you going to build trust as a government if you pick and choose those key issues that you know are highly offensive to the crossbench and the Greens, and yet you're going to try and rely on them to be in government? So this comes to that issue of personal relationships. It's not quite as simple as saying you can have it both ways. You can't have it both ways, because if you do, you undermine that relationship.
But also, ultimately, the truth is the floor of the Parliament is where decisions should be made. Personally, I don't believe planning decisions for stadiums should be made on the floor of the Parliament. Don't get me wrong there. That's a stupid place to make a decision like that. But the floor of the Parliament should decide these things. And so the beauty of the arrangement we had in 10 to 14 was the Greens could be part of government, but actually Nick still needed to go back to his party room, because even if the Greens voted in Cabinet for something, and the Cabinet, and I got the Labor Party, we still only had 12 out of the 25 votes, because without the Greens backbench, effectively, so, am I allowed to say this, Kath? So unless Kim decided he was going to play nice, we still could lose votes on the floor of the House. So there was a beautiful tension there, which made it very complex and difficult and exhausting, but the tension created really good policy.
And I would just add to that, regardless of how the Liberal and Labor government, well, the Liberal and Labor parties vote on, maybe it will be a Liberal-Labor government, there you go, coalition, how they vote in the lower house, again, it comes back to the upper house, right? And again, it comes back to relationships and trust and providing the information that we need to make an informed decision. And to date, I personally didn't have the information I needed to be able to make an informed position on the stadium, and I still hold that position now, and whatever happens from here, I'll continue to seek out all of that information to help inform my decision, and it will be about relationships and that information, and I think that's a really important role of the Legislative Council going forward on any issue.
I think something that sometimes gets missed when talking about the crossbench, both by its critics and by its supporters, is that a lot of the crossbench's power comes only when they're voting with one major party or the other, because that's how you get the 50% plus one, with the notable exception of the Tasmanian Legislative Council, but everywhere else in Australia, that's the case. And so Fred Chaney, the former Liberal minister, points to this and compares it to the Democrats' slogan of keep the bastards honest. And he says, well, you need one or other of the bastards in order to keep the other bastards honest. The major parties are always going to have a real role to play in holding government to account, in the conduct of Parliament, in which votes get up and how they're decided.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. I apologise if there's one really burning question. Can we hang around for another 2 minutes? Couple of minutes? Go ahead.
My name's Maria Riedel. I've been attending the Planning Commission's hearings on the stadium. Beck, you just said you can't make up your mind. How many people in this room don't want the stadium at Mac Point? Put your hands up. That's a majority. So if you're listening to the people, that's who you should listen to. Last time, the Labor guy, the Labor Party went into an election saying, we don't believe in a stadium. I've got the stickers on my car. Then they flipped. People that voted for the Labor Party would have been utterly disappointed. There are Labor people that don't want the stadium there. So really, perhaps listen to what people are actually saying in this room and the amount of people that have said no to the stadium because of the cenotaph, the views, the massive dome, etc.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I assure you I'm listening to all views.
Okay. Okay, so we've heard from these amazing panel members. Thank you all so much for making the time to come along tonight. It's about trust, relationships, practical protocols and mechanisms, and sticking to your word. They are the key things that I'm taking away from tonight. Can we please thank our panel members for coming? And thank you all very much for coming on a cold winter's night. And I'd like to thank our team in Canberra who organised tonight's event. And please remember, we are a charity. We rely on donations from people like you to do what we do. We literally couldn't do it without your support. So please consider making a donation when you get home tonight. You can do it online. And while you're there, if you want to, you can sign up to get our emails and our newsletters. And if you want to get specific Tasmanian updates, remember to put your postcode in. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks for watching. We love that we can make these videos free to watch, but they're not free to make. It's thanks to our generous supporters that we can keep making research and content that changes minds. So, if you like what we do, please consider giving to the Australia Institute so we can keep doing it. Visit our website australiainstitute.org.au and click the donate button to see how your support can help fund high quality research that matters.